Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Mongabay's free webinar series for journalists, broadcast to you live. While you can view this webinar on YouTube, you can also view it on Twitter and LinkedIn and interact with us there. That said, I do recommend that you subscribe to our YouTube channel so that you can be notified of future discussions when they are announced. So today's webinar focuses on how to cover great apes. And Mongabay is currently seeking your pitches for stories on great apes, and it's fairly easy to submit one. Head to mongabay.org, click on the opportunities page, scroll down the page, and click on apes. Please note that at the end of March, we ask that if you have any other ape-related stories, please submit them via the Africa and Southeast Asia links listed on that same page. As always, we very much appreciate any pitches that you send to us, but we also encourage you to pitch your story ideas to other outlets, if not to us as well. Don't forget to sign up for our occasional email newsletter, which you can also find there on the opportunities page, which shares new paid reporting opportunities and also job openings here at Mongabay. So we have roughly a slate of 10 questions for our panelists today. And just like in previous webinars, at the conclusion of the hour-long session, we will be opening the floor to your questions. If you have any thoughts or comments, please feel free to leave them on the platform that you're tuning in on today, and we will address them towards the top of the hour. So I'm going to go ahead and introduce our panelists, starting with Linus Unah. He is a journalist and producer largely focused on wildlife conservation, environmental science, and development. His work has appeared on Al Jazeera, The Guardian, NPR, Mongabay, National Public Radio, and several other outlets. He is currently a second-year documentary student at the University of California, Berkeley's Graduate School of Journalism. Linus, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you very much, and really excited to be here.
And also joining us is Dr. Eric Maillard. He is a conservation scientist and practitioner with long-term experience working in the Asian tropics. He is the director of Borneo Features in Brunei Darussalam and an honorary professor at the Durrell Institute of Conservation and Ecology in Canterbury, UK. He also co-chairs the IUCN Oral Crops Task Force and is an avid writer in popular and scientific media, focusing on wildlife conservation challenges, including commentary about orangutans. Eric, thank you for joining us.
Great to be on this show, and excited to share some of my thoughts on orangutan conservation with you.
And I am your host and moderator, Mike DiGirolamo, the Audience Engagement Associate for Mongabay. So to recap, if you're tuning in just now, you can join us on Twitter, YouTube, and LinkedIn. Feel free to leave any questions you have for our panelists, and we'll do our best to address them at the end of this hour-long session as time allows. You will also be able to view this webinar on demand on our YouTube channel a day or two after we're done here today. Timestamps and resources will be included. If you registered for this webinar, you'll also receive a publication notice to your inbox along with a brief survey, and a link published to this webinar will also be accessible on our blog at the original registration page. So without further ado, let's go ahead and get started. So we're going to tackle this first question. It's a broader one. What do you think are the biggest threats that apes face globally, and how can journalists effectively tell those stories to the world? We'll go ahead and we'll talk a little bit more about localized trends, but first, we're just going to focus on the broader trends.
Shall I go first, Linus, or you want to go?
Yeah, I can go. I mean, pretty quickly, I think globally, like two major challenges that have been identified would be human activity. I mean, there are like very recent studies that have shown that human activity is like one of the biggest threats to great apes, particularly, I mean, like the rise in like commercial logging, mining, and I mean, as you maybe like narrow down to like the African continent, maybe poaching in particular as well. And I think as I've seen, and then habitat loss as well. These are like combination of habitat loss and like human activity, and all of that can be subsumed under human activity. And I guess one way journalists can kind of like help would be to like kind of get into this area and like help people understand how like their everyday activity, whether it's like commercial logging, how this like impacts not just great apes, but like their habitat and the communities that live around them. Just to like help people make connections with what is happening on the ground and how this affects some of these unique species that we have around us. And I guess generally, like people tend to understand when we make the connections really clear. And I think journalists do have like a very huge job to do in terms of like helping like the society make connections between like what we hear every day, whether it's like how commercial logging has increased over the years, or whether it's like mining and like all of these activities that's kind of happening around us, and how they like kind of impact these unique species that we want to protect, and like kind of galvanize people to like pay more attention to it, enhance public knowledge, and then get the public to care more deeply to like maybe like organize around these issues and like kind of reduce the pressures that these unique species face. Throwing that over to you, Eric, if you want to chime in.
Yeah, I think that sums it pretty much up. I mean, my standard answer is indeed habitat loss and killing. Whether you talk about gorillas, chimpanzees, bonobos, orangutans, that is pretty much what it boils down to. Maybe in the African context, diseases like Ebola have really had a big impact on especially Western gorilla populations. But it is those human activities, and I think sometimes the role of sometimes I feel that in the context of great ape conservation, journalists tend to play very much the emotional part of it, and kind of polarizing the debate, or simplifying it, or oversimplifying the debate, as if there is some kind of evil factor, let's say oil palm, against the good factor, the people trying to save great apes like orangutans. But often the reality is a lot more complex, and I think there is a role for journalists to capture that complexity and make it kind of tangible for people without kind of going across into oversimplifications of good and evil, because there are human issues that are at play, and they're rarely simple. So there's a lot there to interact with journalists about. Thanks.
Thanks, Linus and Eric, for the answers. We're going to go ahead and get more detailed here. Are there significant trends that are specific to your area of research or coverage that you would like journalists to be more aware of?
I mean, talking about like localized trends, specifically to Nigeria and the extreme southeastern corner where you have great apes. I mean, human activity, I mean, is heavily linked to like this. The population has grown like rapidly over the last, 3 or 4 decades. As you see, and Nigeria's population generally continues to like increase, and that subsequently kind of translates to like increased pressure on like the great apes habitat. In our case, for example, it means like expanding human settlement, and then also like the need for like more land to like cultivate like crops, and that's like essentially like expanding agriculture. And then in addition to that, there's poaching. Even though like non-profit organizations have been like doing a lot of like incredible work over the past 3 to 4 decades, have found ways to like kind of work with local communities to reduce poaching. The loss of like say one gorilla is like really devastating. It's like a monumental loss, because it takes a lot to like get them to like even procreate and replace that one single individual that's lost. And so specifically in our case, it's like expanding agriculture, and there's also like expanding human settlement, and there's like all of the logging that's happened, which is like fragmenting like the habitat of the gorillas, and like kind of like creating a lot. I mean, there's been a lot of research done as well showing how like habitat fragmentation specifically kind of like would lead to like a lot of like genetic issues in the future, as different like subgroups of like great apes kind of struggle to like kind of like come together, like get to connect. And like I said, I think local nonprofits have been working in Nigeria specifically, have done like a lot of work, to reduce poaching, but still it's like an existential threat. It's still there, because then you're dealing with a situation where there is poverty, there's like also households who depend like heavily on like hunting for like their income. And also there's like increased demand in like urban areas, like wealth has grown over the last few decades as well. And that kind of like means that you would have tensions with local communities specifically as you try to like find ways and quote to like kind of police like the gorilla habitat and find ways to like kind of protect them.
Eric,
Yeah, maybe just to add to that a little bit and put some numbers towards it. It is indeed that kind of friction between a growing number of humans on our planet and a declining number of non-human great apes. We're great apes as well, of course, on that same planet. I mean, where are we now? We're just over 8 billion people, and there are about 1 million great apes left. If you take together all the chimpanzees and western and mountain gorillas and bonobos and orangutans, about 1 million. So for each great ape, there's about 8,000 people, and that number of people per great ape is increasing. So how do you reconcile those tensions that happen around that? And I think sometimes in conservation, you just think like, this is never going to work. I mean, there are just too many people consuming too much, putting too much pressure on or demands on land expansion for agriculture and so on. But then there are some trends that indicate that it doesn't necessarily need to end badly. One area where we do a lot of work in Malaysia and Borneo, kind of coexistence between great apes, in this case orangutans, and agriculture is kind of stabilizing. Like governments are done with the land, the forest is protected, agriculture is assigned. People don't kill orangutans in those areas anymore, and populations are kind of stable. So there is a future there where maybe it's something to do with a certain level of economic development when people are in poverty and have no choices. Things like bushmeat hunting and so play an important role, but there is a situation where these things kind of stabilize, and that's kind of where we want to work towards. So where I work in Asia, the really important trends are reduced deforestation rates in Indonesia and Malaysia, the two countries that have orangutan population. What we don't see a reduction in yet is the number of orangutans that are being killed in different conflict situations, often to do with agriculture. So the landscapes are stabilizing, but the killing rates is not stabilizing yet. And I think that becomes an important thing to focus on in the future. And what we also see, and this is something I think quite important for journalists, is the increasing role of orangutan rehabilitation, so rescues and wild-to-wild translocations that are often in media portrayed as a success. Like, look at these people rescuing that poor orangutan baby from the hands of an evil oil palm concession or an evil farmer. But remember that rehabilitation means failed conservation. That means failed conservation because if you rescue a baby, it means the mother has been killed somewhere, or the habitat has gone missing. So rehabilitation is not a positive conservation outcome. It's good that some people are engaged in it, but we need to solve conservation problems on the ground to make sure that we don't need to go into rescue and rehabilitation. And I think that's something journalists need to think more about, that these are not the success stories in conservation, but they're really the stories of failed conservation.
Thank you for doing that, Eric. Folks, we have a guest that is joining us, an additional guest, and I just want to go ahead and introduce her, and we'll continue with our slate of questions. Joining us also is Dr. Gladys Kalema-Zikusoka. She is the founder and CEO of Conservation Through Public Health, an award-winning NGO that protects endangered gorillas and other wildlife through One Health approaches. And she is also the founder of Gorilla Conservation Coffee, which supports farmers living around gorilla habitats. She is a National Geographic Explorer and a Ashoka Fellow, and is also a member of the World Health Organization Special Advisory Group for the Origin of Novel Pathogens. Dr. Gladys, thank you so much for being here. It's great to have you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for inviting me.
Absolutely. So with that said, we're going to go ahead and move on to our next question here, which has to do with more underreported stories. So are there any stories regarding great apes that you think need a little bit more of the limelight that don't quite get reported as often? Anyone is free to chime in.
You go ahead, Gladys. I've done a lot of talking already. The floor is yours.
Okay. I would say that some of the stories that are a bit underreported, I know that the story of zoonotic disease has been reported, but it could still be reported a lot more, because great apes are one of the biggest threats to great apes is zoonotic disease, especially those that are habituated for tourism or for research. And so I think the stories that are not being reported enough are the threats that great apes are facing due to zoonotic disease transmission. However, it's also an opportunity. I mean, tourism and research are an opportunity to protect the great apes. Without tourism and research, it's very difficult to protect them. But then at the same time, it's presenting a new threat of zoonotic disease. And everybody there needs to be a concerted effort, not only from the people who work with the great apes, which is the protected area managers, the NGOs, and the local communities who live with the great apes, but also the tourists and other people who come to visit. And I think this is a story that it kind of gained momentum during the pandemic, and now it's slowing down a bit, but it's a story that still needs to be told. And also the story that also needs to be told is the need for communities to really benefit from tourism. And when tourists come to visit, they should be willing to spend much more time to visit the local communities and not only to visit the great apes.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gladys. The next question we're going to ask actually dives into that a little bit more. But Eric or Linus, did you have anything to add about underreported stories?
I mean, I can go quickly before Eric takes on, but I think one thing that I think is really exciting that would be great to like kind of begin to look at really closely would be like community-based conservation, and how like environmental charities are kind of like trying to like work with communities to like better protect great apes and like their habitat. I think it's like an area that's not been, like in our case, like in Nigeria specifically, there's not been like fully explored. And it's one where one that requires like not just a lot of coverage, but coverage that brings that doesn't simplify the issue because it's a bit complicated. One that kind of looks at all the complexities there and brings like a lot of nuance to that conversation, because I think it's one area that deserves like some kind of critical conversation, and one that's like extremely important to like, you know, better safeguarding like apes, I mean, for the future.
Yeah, no, I concur. I mean, I think especially in the African context, pretty much all the co-occurrence of people and great apes, the African great apes, happens in a smallholder agricultural context where communities have a choice to either leave forested habitats where gorillas and chimpanzees and bonobos are ranging, or convert it into agriculture. They have a choice between killing or not killing a great ape. In Asia, it's slightly more industrial agriculture, especially in the oil palm industry. But again, it's about individual people having to make choices. And I think we sometimes forget how important it is to listen to people on the ground, but also to give them opportunities. When you're a poor farmer somewhere in the heartland of Borneo, you have a choice. You can shoot at the orangutan, you can leave it in your fruit tree, watching it eat your fruit, or you can cut down forests where the orangutan is roaming, or you don't. What is the incentive for people to decide a certain way? What can we as conservationists offer to people apart from financial rewards, or indeed health programs that have been shown in orangutans to be highly effective, providing a service to people in return for a service of people to great apes. And I think we need to get much sharper in conservation. I hear a lot of rhetoric about community-based conservation, but how good are we really as conservationists in engaging communities and giving them honest and fair choices that move them more towards a situation in which people and great apes can actually coexist. And that is a real challenge for the entire conservation community.
Thank you all. We actually are going to tack on another question here that's related to what you've all been discussing, particularly Dr. Gladys. So prior to the COVID-19 pandemic, there was lots of optimism about ape-based tourism, providing an economic base for conservation programs and incentivizing communities to support, conservation measures. So has that changed since the pandemic? And if so, what are some alternative strategies? Are there new stories coming out of these changes that journalists should be aware of?
I would say that there are new stories because prior to the COVID pandemic, the places where Great Ape tourism was working really well, such as Uganda with gorilla tourism, Rwanda with gorilla tourism, and some parts of Tanzania with great chimpanzee tourism, everyone felt that tourism is the way to go. Tourism is the answer to provide sustainable financing for conservation. But because of all the lockdowns and tourists suddenly disappeared overnight, we were very surprised that poaching suddenly went up, even in places where communities had benefited so much from conservation. In fact, it went up more in those places because such people had come to only rely on tourism to survive. For example, in the case of Bwindi, it's easier for you to carry a tourist luggage to the gorillas as a porter. The money you make in one day, someone else would make in 1 month digging in the garden all day long. So people abandoned what they used to do before and they focused on tourism. Then tourism disappeared overnight. And so the pandemic showed us that we had to find other ways of helping people to survive that are not only dependent on tourism. Actually, one of the ventures that we started before the pandemic, Gorilla Conservation Coffee, where we are supporting coffee farmers bordering the park who were not part of the tourism industry necessarily, because not everybody can be a ranger or a porter or sell crafts or accommodation and meals to tourists. And so actually our biggest customers were the tourists. Then the pandemic comes along and we're stuck because we can only buy coffee from them based on what we sell. And so we were able then to really focus on finding markets outside Uganda. We did find a very steady market in the UK with Money Row Beans, and in the US when they finally opened up to other flights coming in, gccoffeeusa.com. And with Money Row Beans, they placed about 12 orders since the pandemic began, since May 2020. And this meant that we could still support the farmers in spite of no tourists being there, but it's also a measure that we've continued even beyond the pandemic. And another thing we also found actually during the pandemic is that people are poaching because they're hungry. And so we started to provide fast-growing seedlings to the local communities, especially the wife of the poacher who killed a gorilla and had to be put in jail for 11 years for killing the gorilla and the duiker and the bush pig. And he did it because he was hungry, and we provided fast-growing seedlings to 1,500 households. And as we were distributing them, we found that the first 1,000, when we distributed the questionnaire, they said people are poaching because they're hungry. And this is something that we're going to continue beyond the pandemic. So some of the stories journalists could report is how are people adapting to the new norm, which is you can't only rely on tourism to support conservation, to provide sustainable financing for conservation. How are initiatives around the world focusing on other ways to keep conservation programs going in case tourism disappears overnight? And so we're continuing with the Ready to Grow, and we're continuing with looking for markets outside Uganda. And actually, the policy brief I talked about earlier is this one. It's both in English and French. And we launched it during the first IUC and Africa Protected Area Congress. And it's really telling people, to be a responsible tourist when you visit, wear a mask, don't be willing to get close to gorillas because you can make them sick. And with something like COVID, everyone's now used to hearing the words mask, social distance, hand hygiene. So we're using those very same messages for the tourists, but it's also talking about make sure you visit the communities. It's not enough to just see a gorilla and go home, because when a community member meets a tourist, they're much less likely to enter the park to poach.
Eric or Linus, do you have anything to add?
Well, I just completely concur with what Gladys is saying about the need to get more funding into conservation. We published a study last year where we looked at 20 years of conservation, all the conservation funding that went into orangutan conservation, from government, from NGOs, from multinationals, from companies, from communities, which roughly added up over 20 years to $1 billion US. $1 billion was invested over a 20-year period into orangutan conservation. We still managed to lose about 100,000 orangutans. So $1 billion wasn't even enough. Translates into about $10,000 per orangutan over their lifetimes, or $8,000. $8,000 spent per orangutan is not enough. And it has to do with the fact that the opportunity costs of conservation, they're always quite high. I mean, as I said, it's about individual decisions, whether it's a poor man in face to face with a gorilla who's got to make a choice whether he's going to shoot the gorilla or not, or whether it's someone who's going to have a choice between leaving a protected forest or going into it and turning it into agriculture. What do we have communities to offer? Ultimately, I think we need to develop ways of increasing the value of nature that rewards the guardians of nature. And those are the people that actually live there in a fairer way, and give them a real opportunity or an alternative opportunity against the other opportunities which are often destructive. So indeed, converting habitat into non-wildlife habitat and so on. So a lot of money has gone to conservation. It's not been enough. That's the bottom line.
Yes, and there's something else that we picked up on, is the value of improving healthcare in communities bordering great ape habitats to conservation. Of course, the most obvious value is reducing the threat of disease to the great apes, because their neighbors are healthier and there's less likely for zoonotic disease to jump back and forth. But also the very big value is when you improve community health, you make people feel that you don't only care about the wildlife and the forest, but you also care about them, because healthcare is a basic human right. So that's another underreported story. And actually, I've just thought of another one, family planning. You know, a lot of great ape habitats don't have a chance because there's unsustainable human population growth around most great ape habitats. But simple thing like offering access to contraceptives, which is actually not very expensive, because a lot of governments receive it for free anyway from the bilateral donors. But getting it to the people and showing them the value of being able to have a manageable family, have the children they are planned for, they can give proper education and healthcare, and break the poverty cycle, and not have to depend on the forest to survive, is a very holistic and necessary long-term measure if wildlife and protected habitats are going to be around forever. And that's something that has really taken shape. We've done it in Bwindi, and we've seen significant results. People who are having 10 children per family are now resorting to having 4, and people are much happier because they're able to better balance the family budgets, both the men and the women, and women have more control over their bodies. And it means that their children can all go to school, and then they can get meaningful jobs, and they don't have to depend on the forest to survive. There's a lack of teenage pregnancies, and everything improves in the long run for the people and the wildlife.
Thank you very much, Dr. Gladys. Go ahead.
And probably just to chime in quickly would be, I think one big takeaway, Dr. Gladys, from what you've described would be that, especially for like communities that rely so heavily on like ape-based tourism to survive, perhaps, I mean, the big lesson from like the pandemic would be for like nonprofits to begin to like look at like invest in like in social projects that are like kind of like very relevant to the community needs, so that communities that have ordinarily been very supportive of conservation efforts wouldn't have to like, you know, take like 10 steps backward when they lose that source of like revenue.
Yes, definitely.
Thank you all for talking about the COVID impacts on conservation and such. I want to talk about the impacts on journalism now. And Linus, can you share with us, how has the pandemic impacted your work?
I mean, a lot has changed over the last 2 years as well. I mean, it was very difficult when it started. I think probably will take like circle back a bit to like maybe 2020 when it all started, and how, I mean, at that point, much of the work I did was like heavily like travel based. It required like kind of field visits, uh, taking trips to like kind of meet like conservationists like working in the field, and being able to like also be in the communities where like scientists are working and trying to like make sense of like all of what we are reading like in like scientific journals. I guess at that point it really did. I mean, it was very difficult. I mean, to not be able to like get on the ground and like do all of the reporting that was necessary, and then having to like kind of move completely like to like Zoom or like rely on WhatsApp, and in most of these places there, I mean, connectivity is like internet connectivity is like not super reliable, for example, and it's so difficult sometimes to like. I recall for once like in 2020, like waiting for maybe like 3-4 weeks to just get like feedback from someone I needed to talk to who was like in this remote area and had like no access to like connectivity, or needed to like go like drive for like maybe 30 minutes to get to another town to be able to like connect. But I think a lot has changed, and in many ways we're kind of like reverted to like what we used to have before the pandemic. I mean, people can travel now and people can get on the ground, and I think like it's the impact has kind of like significantly over the last 2 years kind of like reduced, and we're like back to what we're used to. I guess it kind of like also like opened up a lot of opportunities, and in terms of being able to like use a lot of like virtual tools, whether it's Zoom or like find other ways to like kind of gather responses from like the sources or like people on the ground that we need to talk to. I don't think I mean speaking specifically to myself that I mean looking in 2023, like I'm able to do all of what I used to do prior to the pandemic. It was really difficult like when the pandemic started. At the moment it seems like I mean we're back to what we're used to. I mean up until even 2022, I guess the other challenge was not being able to like access certain sites like say rehabilitation centers, because I mean there's that huge fear about like disease transmission, and I guess that made it really difficult, for example, to say if you're shooting like chimpanzees like in a rehabilitation center, and you're not able to like really get as close as you want to get certain kind of shots, and even all of the whole preparations that have to like go into place before you're able to like kind of access that site. I think it causes like a lot of like significant delays, and of course the industry as a whole like tries on like deadlines. That's the only way we can get stories out to the public. But I would say in 2023 we're like in many ways back to the kind of life we used to have before the pandemic. Yeah.
Thank you very much for sharing that. So I'm going to go ahead and address this to our two researchers here. As a scientist or conservation expert, what do you think journalists can do better at when communicating about ape-related news or research?
Well, maybe, and I quite often see this with orangutan reporting, is that journalists seem to kind of seek to focus on emotions and emotive issues, and quite often end up in this kind of polarized debate. The great Western savior who comes and rescues the poor orangutan baby from the hands of the evil oil palm. And I don't always find that particularly useful. I mean, oil palm has had a lot of negative impacts on the habitat of orangutans for sure, but people forget, for example, that oil palm in Africa means an entirely different thing. I was in Liberia last month for a couple of weeks, and all smallholders there have oil palm. The national diet is based on palm oil. Oil palm is not an evil tree, and quite often I find that that journalists tend to kind of simplify these things in polarized contexts. And I would challenge journalists to seek and dig a little deeper into these complex conservation situations and try to find a little bit of nuance. Like what are we dealing with here? How do you resolve some of these issues of poverty and people's aspirations and a very sensitive species like the group of species like great apes, very slowly reproducing. Any takeoffs, any killing that happens is really detrimental to their survival. What are the nuances and what are the ways forward? I quite often find that especially the bigger media seek very simple stories, and I know emotion sells, and I know that attracts readers, but it doesn't really help much in finding a solution. So I think journalists have a challenge there to be more informed about what's really going on.
Thank you, Eric. Dr. Gladys?
Yeah, I would say that I agree with Eric for sure. Journalists need to report more, like they need to report in more detail. I know it takes more work to really dig into what are the causes for particular problems happening and what are the solutions and how all the solutions are coming together. And it takes longer to get those stories, to research on those stories and get them out. But it's really important for people to understand that it takes more than one solution to solve the problem, and it takes more than one initiative. And it's all about different things working together because there's so many things that are going on at the same time. So yeah, just digging a little deeper into the stories about great ape conservation and can really help to have more complete stories. So you don't miss out.
I fully agree. They're quite often we have this sort of silver bullet idea. If you can only just solve that, and all problems will be solved. No, it's a little bit more complicated than that. And journalists play an important role in telling that complexity.
Yes, and not like be so sensational. Because it stops people reporting on real issues that need to be reported upon.
Exactly.
Yeah, because they're scared it's going to be taken out of context, and yet people need to know about it. So there's also that as well.
Very true.
And on that note, this question is for you, Linus. As a journalist, how can scientists and conservation groups do a better job of communicating and cooperating with journalists who are interested in reporting on apes?
I'm really glad you talked about like cooperation, and it's extremely like very important because I guess just also like listening to Eric and Dr. Gladys, you just find that there's this huge fear, especially among like the scientific community, and but also like with NGOs generally about like misrepresentation of facts or like like also like oversimplifying certain issues, and I guess like that is one area that very strategic and like close active collaboration can address, and where journalists and like scientists and like nonprofits generally like see themselves as like being part of like a larger group where we have to like find ways to like kind of understand each other, communicate with each other very clearly and effectively, and find effective ways to like get the message to the public in ways that they would very importantly like understand and without necessarily like simplifying the issue. And I think for me, one thing that I've found really useful, like when it comes to collaborating with scientists, is what I would say sometimes like make the science make sense to me. And one way to do that is by visiting the field and like kind of visiting local communities where all of this work has been done. So field visits are like really essential. I think they in many ways help the journalists to like kind of make sense of what you're saying, or like make sense of what they've read in like the reports that have been written, or like make sense of like the 20, 30, 40, 50 page of report that you've kind of submitted to them. Getting on the ground kind of helps you see whether it's like the tensions that the report does not like kind of explain like in all its complexities, or like just getting in there like in the site can also help you see things that independently like kind of verify for yourself, and like ask like very tough questions, whether it's like of like scientists themselves, of like or of non-profits who are like working in the field. I think also the science community generally has to do a better job of like finding ways to like kind of communicate, whether it's their research or the work they're doing to journalists, without trying to veer towards sounding too jargony or getting buried in like complicated terminologies. I think sometimes that again like kind of creates like all of that whole confusion, because then you essentially like kind of asking someone to become like like a scientist overnight, or like and some journalists do not have that training as well. Like some people who have covered the beach for a very long time, it's super easy to like kind of make sense of all of this really big jargony words that like thrown at them. And I remember like when I got into the industry newly, how sometimes you talk to a scientist for like a whole hour and you just have to like, it's either like do that field visit or like spend several hours trying to make sense of what they've said, because like all of the time has been spent on like really like very complicated terminologies that sometimes do not exactly like convey the important information, sorry, that you want the journalist to take away. So I think finding ways to reduce jargon and complicated terminologies would be really great without oversimplifying the issue, which is there are ways, I mean, a very classic example would be people saying not many people know what hectares are, and that's like when you're communicating to the public. But comparing like a hectare to the size of like a football or like a soccer pitch can make much more sense to like people than like yeah. Yeah, throwing not to say that hectare is like a very complicated term, but also like I would say like finding a way in terms of like reaching out to journalists actively, especially for like peer-reviewed articles you've written, or even like some findings you like making on the ground, or like some heavy like opinionated like articles you've written about your work. It's super important to like kind of condense that and like kind of shoot an email out. You never know who would find that interesting, and until you communicate, sometimes people don't know what you're doing, or like I mean some of the emerging trends that are like kind of coming out from like where you're working, or like the sites you're working, or the local communities you're dealing with. So it helps to like constantly reach out and stay in touch. That does help. And I guess also the other issue is like this thing about timelines, because we operate in like two different worlds. It's for the journalists, it's like heavily like timeline, deadline based, and for the scientists, sometimes used to like a system where you can take several weeks or so to like think through like ideas and like get to like find ways to like write that down and like get them into like whether it's journals or something. And it's finding ways to like find a middle ground or some kind of balancing act where the journalist reaches out. It's so important to find ways to like get back to them as soon as you can, because yeah, faster responses are like, I mean, it's like a huge asset to the journalism community, especially when, because there are deadlines to be met, and it can be a little frustrating when, and I do know people have very busy lives and sometimes we're asking a lot of them, but yeah, getting back to journalists like super fast, it does help a lot. And I think one other thing I would say is sometimes you talk to people who have done a lot of like really important work, but they really struggle to communicate why, whether they are finding or their discovery or the work they're doing is important. And then it's like kind of like you're leaving the journalist to like figure all these things out for yourself. And it's, I think one question I usually would try like scientists or like conservation nonprofits is like, why is what you're doing important? What huge problem or need or gap does he address? And finding like a very crisp short answer to that kind of like it's like a very important conversation starter, because then there's like a point. I understand very clearly what you're doing and what need or gap it fills, and that becomes like a point for us to like kind of dive deeper into the work you're doing. I hope that helps.
Thank you very much for that answer. We have about 12 minutes to get through a few more questions, so I'm going to try and judiciously select a few here. I do want to talk about a commonly trafficked species that don't receive more attention. So sometimes media coverage focuses on high-profile seizures of charismatic species, while less known species threatened by trade can perhaps slip under the radar a little bit. What are some species that are commonly trafficked that don't receive more attention from the press?
Whew, caught me out there with that question. I think there's a whole bunch of species that go in very large amounts to China that most people would never even have heard of, and are very much underreported. There's a lot of reptiles. Entire Indonesian landscape, there's a gecko that used to be incredibly common. Whether you were in a village, in a city, or in a forest, every night you would hear these geckos. They've just completely disappeared. They're just not around anymore. All picked up by little boys, taking them off the tree, taking them to a middleman, taking them to a trader, and sent off by the millions and millions to for medicinal trade. Very little reporting on these issues. So you're totally right that there's a strong focus on the charismatic stuff, the great apes, the elephants, the tigers, and so on. But some of these volumes are absolutely incredible, of the amount of wildlife that is shipped all across the world, and the huge amount of money that is associated with that.
I would say that there's still a bit of chimp trafficking, in some places. Well, at least in some parts of Africa where there's the bushmeat trade is quite, people still eat great apes. There is trafficking in that area, and it's not talked about so much, just because it's all done locally. People get them from the forest and eat them locally, so it's not talked about so much.
Linus, do you have anything to add?
No, I think Eric and Dr. Gladys have kind of like addressed that specifically. I would guess not. I don't know if this directly relates to your question, but it's also like, I guess like the cross-border trade itself, this is something to like kind of look at like more closely. Because it's especially as it pertains to great apes, but like other smaller species as well. Because then you've got like a lot happening like across the border, especially as it pertains to like West and Central Africa in particular.
All right, thank you very much for that. So my next question is, it has to do with protected areas. What are some kind of issues that can arise when ape conservation strategies involve setting up national parks or protected areas, particularly concerning the human rights and the economic needs of the community members who live in those areas? What questions should journalists be asking?
I would say that some of the questions journalists should be asking is, are the local people going to benefit from the protection of this, from creating a protected area for great apes? And if they are, then they should really promote that side of the story. Without being biased, but they should really promote that, because we've seen a classic example, like in Bwindi, the creation of Bwindi Impenetrable National Park from a forest reserve lifted so many people out of poverty. It could have been an issue of a human rights issue, you're taking people's land from them. But in the end, now people are always wanting to sell their land because their land now has a high price. And the land that we want to sell is land that is always full of human-wildlife conflict. So, and they're benefiting from tourism. They're now seeing the gorillas as their future. They're benefiting from all the benefits that are coming in from different stakeholders because of the gorillas. So I think it would be good to report that side of why it's positive to create a protected area, for sure.
Thank you. Eric or Linus, do you have anything to add?
In general, I'm looking for management. I think great ape populations need protective management. That can be indeed national parks or protected areas, but ultimately, I just want to see management, whether it's community management in community forests, whether it's management by a company. I've worked with companies that have set aside large areas that contain hundreds of orangutans, or indeed a protected area. Ultimately, it boils down to setting up some kind of legal system where the local stakeholders have a strong say in how the threats to great apes are being managed, while at the same time ensuring that they have a livelihood from those areas as well. Protected areas can play that role, but it doesn't necessarily need to be protected areas. Conservation can be achieved in lots of different contexts. And one of the things we're learning about great apes is that ecologically, they're really quite resilient. I mean, we see orangutan populations surviving in really quite fragmented habitats or landscapes with a lot of agriculture, and they're smart. They can survive if there is no killing, and it provides opportunities to see conservation solution, not just in strictly protected areas that may infringe on human rights and other rights issues, but also in more multi-use landscapes. That is definitely possible, but challenging. But But I think you'll find that probably 80% of the remaining great apes occur outside protected areas, and that locking all these populations in protected areas is going to be quite challenging. So we do need some of these solutions where people are using the landscapes for agricultural or other purposes, and at the same time we need to achieve solutions, conservation solutions for great apes and other threatened and endangered wildlife.
Thank you, Eric.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I guess like Eric raised a very important point for me, which is like management and to a very large extent as well, like community agency. It's something that I'm like particularly interested when we talk about like protected areas, because some communities in Nigeria in the past, like with the establishment of like protected areas, especially national park, had like their agency taken away entirely, and we're not like heavily like part of like that decision making process. And I think I'm like usually like when it comes to this very area, it's like one aspect that I think we have to pay really close attention to is like how we can create like co-management like strategies or like initiatives where like communities who live next to these protected areas have a say, because then in the end like they're the people you need to really like in the long term like protect like the great apes and their habitat. And I think it's important to find ways to like get communities like heavily involved, not just on paper, but like getting them into like decision making roles and incorporating them into like pretty much like every important decision that you make with regards to like whether it's like the protected area itself or like the community itself that lives next to them. Because as we've seen across West Africa specifically, that sometimes like heavily like using that authoritarian approach to creating like protected areas and like policing them heavily have not in many ways like been the solution to like whether it's like protecting the habitats or like the great apes themselves, and giving communities agency, making sure they're part of like the management and making sure that we involve them like in pretty much all the very important decisions we make would in the long run help us like protect great apes.
Thank you
Yeah.
very much. So go ahead, Dr. Gladys.
Community-led conservation is, I think, what you're really talking about, letting them lead the conservation efforts wherever they are.
Yeah, it could be a mix of it.
I've written about this a lot in my book, Working with Gorillas, which is coming out in a couple of weeks' time. And I'm really happy that the head of Mongabay has endorsed it. But it really talks about, you know, in my work with gorillas, I've had to work with communities, and now we're encouraging them to lead the conservation efforts wherever they are. Because if they lead them, then they own them, so that even if the wildlife is outside the protected area, they'll still own it and want to protect the wildlife.
Thank you all for your responses. We do have about like 2 minutes left before we have to start the audience Q&A. I just want to go ahead and recap some resources for journalists that you recommend. So what are some resources that you all recommend journalists use for their reporting?
Well, I'm a scientist, so I'd say, and I totally agree with Linus that scientists are terrible storytellers, and it's way too complicated, and there's way too much jargon. But science is trying to be objective in representing the truth, and I think it is always a good starting point to at least involve scientists to a certain extent and just see what the scientific view on certain issues is before developing your storyline. And if you don't understand the scientific papers, get in touch with the scientists who can speak English and translate it to you into normal language. Because again, I fully agree that we're really quite bad in telling a clear story to journalists.
Yeah, we definitely need to get better at communicating. I think that's something I've had to learn while writing the book. Luckily, I had people who are good at editing to help me break down that story so that everyone can understand what we're trying to say. You know, explain something very simply. Science in a very simple way is something that journalists can really help us in.
I still want to push back to Linus. I don't think journalists should be writing about football fields of deforestation. Come on. What are we talking about? American football fields, Manchester City grounds. There's so much variation. People know what a hectare is. People know what a kilometer is. Come on, we have these measures for a good reason. So that's my final point.
But something like zoonotic disease, we could call it zoonotic disease, or we could call it something simpler.
True. Yeah.
Yeah, it's
animals.
not to say you can use all those terms. It's just finding ways to like probably find other like suitable metaphors that can help people like make sense of those. And to the question about resources, I guess one that I found really helpful would be also like looking at places like the Society for like Environmental Journalists. I do think they have like a ton of like, whether it's grants or like workshops or like fellowships, but also like a ton of resources about like how to like cover, whether it's like zoonotic diseases or like the intersection between like health and like conservation. There's a bunch of stuff there. It's like, so the list is quite long, but in terms of like resources, there's one place to look at, I guess.
All right, thank you so much. We're going to go ahead and move on to our audience questions. We've got quite a lot of them, so I'll do my best to get through as many as we can. We have about 15 or 20 minutes. This one is actually touching on a question that we didn't get to, and it's for Eric. Could you talk a little bit about the difficulties in Indonesia for journalists and environmentalists and those working in NGOs involved in orangutan rescue?
Well, in Indonesia specifically, I think there's an increasingly small space for NGOs and scientists to speak out. And I've been a victim myself. I've been banned from doing research in Indonesia because of things we published in the Indonesian media about orangutan conservation that criticized the government. And since then, the government has basically shut us down. It doesn't really affect me personally, but I'm really concerned about how this is affecting the opportunity, the ability of NGOs, non-governmental groups, and independent scientists to operate freely. So I think that that space to communicate is definitely narrowing down, and I think there are definitely tendencies in the government to generate alternative realities or alternative narratives about conservation, because the great apes are such recognized global conservation icons. If you're losing great apes as a country, that is really seriously bad PR. If you can change that narrative and make it sound like actually things are going quite well, that is really important. And if you're closing down the opportunity of people to criticize those kind of alternative realities, the alternative realities become the reality. And I think this is somehow happening in Indonesia. I'm least concerned about it, listening to people working there and how they're increasingly curtailed in their ability to communicate freely.
Thank you for sharing that, Eric. It looks like we had a similar comment come in from Jerry saying, could the panel address the threat to environmental journalists for reporting on issues at the depth that Eric and Gladys suggested? So I guess, Linus, also, if you had an opportunity here to describe some of the threats that environmental journalists face, this would probably be a good time to answer that as well.
Yeah, sure. I can, jump in quickly, but I think as we've seen sometimes that, especially when it pertains to like commercial logging and mining and sometimes agriculture as well, is something that's not like, it's not even done by local communities, but like very powerful interest. And that on its own alone poses like a lot of threats, especially in terms of safety. In the case of Nigeria, for example, you've had instances where it's like state governors, for example, like maybe trying to like view certain kinds of infrastructure that kind of like would fragment like critical habitat, and getting into those areas can sometimes even mean losing your life, for example. And yeah, that is like a very, very, very huge, but also like beyond governors, sometimes you have like very big, powerful interests, like huge multinational companies that are like kind of involved in these issues. And like, just by virtue of like, being a journalist and like trying to like cover these stories and like bring it to the public alone like means that you would have to watch your back constantly, and like sometimes in some cases like be on the run. And that is itself, in all honesty, is like it's a huge source of concern. And we've seen in some places as well where environmental journalists have been killed for trying to like, spotlight some of these issues and like bring them to the public. And of course that does deter some people, but it's again like we most of the people who do journalism do it because they care like really deeply about the issue and about like like bringing these issues to the public. And I think generally uh would not necessarily like overlook the threats, but would understand that this is there and the story still has to be done. And the big challenge that it poses to like our safety is something that worries me a lot, like with some of the kind of stories I do, especially when you've got huge, powerful interests, whether it's like multinational companies or like powerful politicians being like involved with, whether it's commercial logging or like agriculture or like rubber or palm oil plantations. And I mean, I've seen instances where people have to flee for safety entirely, or even like, move with their families because of certain kind of stories they do, or situations where like you're doing a story and you've got like contingency plans to move as well as soon as that is published. That all of this like combined like discourages people from like telling certain stories. But I think overall it's like that threat to safety and sometimes in some cases like even getting jailed for like, speaking truth to power is also there.
Thank you very much for sharing, Linus. I do want to get to a couple more questions here. I have one from Ian saying, do you think that the commitments made at the CBD, the Convention for Biological Diversity at COP15 in Montreal last December, will make a difference, especially 30 by 30 and new funding for biodiversity?
I believe that those commitments will make a difference. That is, if the commitments are actually followed through. I think they really make a big difference because there is more funding that's definitely needed for biodiversity. All the countries just have to be ready to do it and take it seriously. And then, yeah, I really think it can make a difference. I like the focus on empowering communities and community-led conservation. That's what everyone's talking about now. It's moving away from community-based to community-led. It's come from community engagement to community-based conservation to community-led. So the more that we can engage the local stakeholders in conservation, whether it's at a community level or a national level, the better we are going to go with conserving biodiversity.
Could I take a step back to the previous question, and especially what Linus was saying, because I think this is about what journalism can do in environmental conservation. And there's a really good example from Indonesia where one of the orangutan species, the Tapanuli orangutan, the most threatened great ape species in the world. There's fewer than probably 700 left in the wild, heavily threatened by hydro dam development, commercial mining, geothermal projects, agriculture, and so on. There's been a real crackdown on information about that. Someone was killed from an NGO, never quite clear what happened, but quite a scary situation. But very recently, a whole bunch of Indonesian and media groups have gotten together and started jointly reporting about it. And I think this is really powerful. It's only just started last week or so, one story after the other. And I think there's sort of the feeling like individually you're exposed, but you all get together and you start reporting on these issues as one common voice among different media groups. It does really resonate and provides a very strong narrative, counter narrative against what people are sort of reading from the government. So I think there's a really important role for environmental journalists working together on some of these issues.
Yeah, we've had an issue of, like a forest in Uganda, Bugoma forest, which there's been lots of pressure to cut down trees for sugarcane. I think the journalists really went behind reporting on that, and the conservationists all got together and It was like one whole campaign against this, actually not only from the civil society, but from the government as well. So as Eric says, that really made a difference. I mean, once everybody's united, it's hard for people to now target the journalists.
Thanks very much. This was this sort of calls back to something we talked about a little bit earlier, and we might be repeating ourselves a little bit here, but there's more perspectives to be had. And it's a question I didn't get to ask earlier, but what can journalists and media organizations do to bring a wider variety of voices, perspectives, and opinions into stories about apes?
I think the very first one, and one that's really big for me, is redefining who an expert is. I think it's really like key to like expanding like the wide range of voices that we can bring to stories, because sometimes there's like this big obsession with experts, like all the people who are heavily trained in like a subject and who have done like a lot of like scientific writing. But I mean, like specifically when it comes to covering great apes, I've also met people from like local communities who have since like the 1980s been there even before like conservationists came in, and like have done like a lot of like had like a lot of interaction with great apes and like their habitat, and just know so much about them by virtue of like seeing these things like every day. So they've got like the lived experiences to be able to like add their own like exciting like perspectives about these issues. And I guess like once we begin to redefine who is an expert, or even expand like that definition for who constitutes an expert, I think it provides like a very huge opportunity for us to include like a wide range of voices. I guess another way to like do that would be to allow for like various like response formats. Generally, it's like some people, like I mentioned earlier, it's like some in the case of Nigeria, like caught up like in communities or remote communities where like connectivity is like a very big issue, or even like making like something as basic as a phone call, they might need to like travel really far to do something like that. And creating avenues where people can like respond to like our questions or like our queries, whether it's like through emails, whether it's like through WhatsApp voice notes, um, whether it's like through phone calls, like creating like expanding like the avenues for like collecting responses for people generally also helps. Um, and I guess sometimes, I mean, what I've found really useful sometimes is like posing like a very general question to a lot of sources, and being very careful about whose voice is like critical to kind of understanding this story, what perspectives need to be included, and posing like a very general question to like a lot of people in many ways like opens up like the story itself to like a wide range of opinion from like different sources. And I guess for like the media, and I know Mongabay is doing this, and some other like platforms are doing a great job at that as well. It's like user submitted stories or content is also like very useful. So opening up like the space for people from like a diverse range of background to be able to like share like their thoughts and opinions, like by calling them to like contribute. And whether it's like opinion, or I mean traditionally the media has done that with like letters for uh maybe readers digest, or like readers later or something, or letters for the editor. I mean, they've called it like different sort of names, and sometimes by like inviting the public to contribute, you're able to like hear from people that you would traditionally not hear from, because I mean for long they've been marginalized, or for long they've not had that avenues or opportunities like extended to them to talk, even though like their voices are really important, I guess. But at the heart of that for me is like when we begin to redefine who we call an expert, or what what do you have to do to be called an expert, I guess. Would Once we begin to like look at that really critically and like include people who have the lived experiences and in that conversation, I'm sure would add a lot more voices to like whether it's like conversations about like Great Ape or like the environment generally.
Eric or Dr. Gladys, do you have anything to add?
I think the issue of the expert, as you said, who is the expert? The expert could be somebody who can't speak English, but has very important information. So being able to get that information from them is really what can help to understand that story. So yeah, diversifying. I noticed that very often journalists, obviously they'll go to speak to the men because the men are more confident or more willing to speak, but we should have more female voices. I think journalists should make more of an effort wherever they are to speak to the women in the room, not only the men, or the women in the village, not only the men. So I think that can really make a big difference. And the youth, the children, they also have a lot of important things to say.
Thank you very much.
Yeah,
well,
maybe just quickly, I would always say don't ever trust anyone who calls themselves an expert. We're clearly we're not good at what we're doing. If we call ourselves expert because we've been working in orangutan or in great ape conservation, we wouldn't be losing them. If we were any good at that work, we wouldn't be losing them. So we may know a lot, but I fully agree that yeah, be careful with that whole thing of expertise. I mean, ultimately, the expertise lies with the people who are going to make a change, and the change will need to happen on the ground. And I know a lot about orangutan conservation, but I would be very careful to consider myself an expert who has the answers, especially because those silver bullet answers generally don't exist.
Thank you very much, Eric. Well, so that's all. Sorry, that's all we have pretty much had time for today. I wanted to go ahead and give a big thank you to our panelists for joining us and providing their expertise and insights. You are experts, so thank you for being here. And as always, thank you to our audience for participating in this webinar. We really do appreciate you all being here. I just want to remind you that if you RSVP to this event, you should receive an email containing a survey asking for your thoughts. So I encourage you to fill that out to let us know what you think so that we can keep improving these webinars. Once again, this will be published on our YouTube channel within the next 24 hours or so, along with timestamps and resources that were shared today. And it will also be accessible via the registration post on our blog as well. If you have any ideas that you want to pitch to us, please do so at our opportunities page at mongabay.org. Scroll down and click on Apes. And while there, please do sign up for our occasional email newsletter, which shares new paid reporting opportunities and job openings with us. Also, please subscribe to our YouTube channel here and follow us on social media for announcements of future discussions. You can get updates about all of them via our accounts on Twitter, Facebook, LinkedIn, and Mastodon, where we will post announcements in advance of each discussion. If you haven't already checked out our podcast, I also recommend you do so, the Mongabay Newscast. Occasionally, we have announcements there as well. And I just want to remind you, next month, we will be doing another webinar on coastal climate solutions. That's it, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.